"I need food," she said to the millionaire. The street cleaner holding a baby left him in shock, and his reaction. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching from. Let's begin. On a rainy, chilly night in New York City, the towers of the wealthy Upper East Side seemed even farther removed from the reality of most people. The wet sidewalks reflected the few luxury cars still driving down the empty streets, while the city tried to shelter itself from an unrelenting storm. Against all comfort, a young woman in an orange uniform, drenched from head to toe, walked slowly, cradling something in her arms as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Grace Turner, 28 years old, had just finished another shift as a sanitation worker. With nowhere to go, she wandered aimlessly through the richest part of Manhattan. In her arms, her 5-month-old daughter, Emily, whimpered from cold and hunger, curled tightly against her mother's chest. With the rent overdue, no close family, loneliness in the streets, and a merciless storm, Grace was on the brink of despair. Her few possessions were in an old backpack, hidden behind a tree to keep from getting wet. There was no time to think of tomorrow. She needed to survive that night with her daughter. Spotting a grand old mansion surrounded by a well-tended garden, with lights shining and a facade of stone and fine wood, Grace took a deep breath. It was the Evans mansion. She recognized it, having swept that sidewalk every Tuesday and Thursday. Embarrassed but driven by maternal instinct, she approached and rang the bell. She waited. Rain pounded her neck. She rang again. Emily's cries hurt her heart even more than the cold. On the third try, the wooden door opened partially, and a man in a suit, tired and reserved, looked at her in surprise. Thomas Evans, a successful tech entrepreneur, lived alone with his young son since his wife, Beatrice, had passed away nearly 2 years ago. The mansion that once hosted dinners and laughter was now silent, marked by a cold mechanical routine. He wasn't expecting visitors, much less a soaking wet woman with a baby in her arms. Grace, her voice trembling, just said she needed food for her daughter. She didn't ask for a handout, didn't beg for shelter. She offered to work in exchange for food. Her firm posture, even in the face of humiliation, left him speechless. Moved by something he didn't fully understand, Thomas let her in. In the warm, clean main hall, the contrast between their worlds was stark. Grace, drenched from head to toe, left wet marks on the white marble floor. The baby was wrapped in a blanket, while the smell of warm milk began to fill the room. Though hesitant, Thomas showed them to a downstairs room where they could spend the night. "It's not charity," he told himself as he fetched clean towels from the hall closet. "There's just the decent thing to do." Grace observed every detail of the house, so far from the reality she knew. On the walls, family photos captured moments of happiness frozen in time. A boy with curly hair and a wide smile appeared in almost all of them, next to a couple. As the photos became more recent, the female figure disappeared. Only the man and the boy remained, looking more and more serious, more and more distant from each other. "The bathroom is over there," Thomas indicated, returning with towels and some clothes. "These should fit you." They belonged to... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. Grace understood what he meant. "Thank you so much, Mr. Evans. I promise we'll be gone first thing in the morning." He nodded, not quite knowing how to respond. He wasn't used to handling situations like this. His life had become a sequence of scheduled events, meetings, appointments, and the constant silence of the mansion when he came home. The presence of this woman and the baby broke a routine he hadn't even realized was suffocating him. While Grace showered, Emily started crying again. Thomas awkwardly tried to soothe her. He held her as if she were made of glass, rocking her gently. "Shh, little one," he whispered. "Your mom will be right back." The crying subsided for a moment, as if the baby understood his words. Dark brown eyes stared at him with curiosity. And for a moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a genuine connection with another human being. When Grace returned, wearing an oversized t-shirt and sweatpants, she found her daughter nestled in Thomas's arms. He looked lost but determined to keep the baby calm. The scene caught her by surprise. "She stopped crying," Thomas commented, handing Emily back. "She doesn't usually like strangers," Grace replied, taking her daughter. "Thank you for looking after her." Thomas just nodded, looking away. "There's food in the fridge. Help yourself. We can talk more tomorrow." And with those words, he retreated upstairs, leaving them alone. In the room assigned to them, Grace fed Emily and put her to sleep. For the first time in days, she felt she could breathe without the constant weight of fear. Her hands still trembled when she thought about what she had done, knocking on the door of a mansion, asking a stranger for help. She had never imagined herself in this situation, but life had taught her that pride doesn't feed or protect a child. The hours passed slowly. The sound of rain against the windows created a melody that lulled her restless thoughts. Grace couldn't sleep. She got up and began to tidy the room, organize her few belongings, fold the borrowed clothes. It was her way of saying thank you, of showing she wasn't a freeloader as many might think. Upstairs, Thomas couldn't sleep either. The presence of the woman and child had awakened memories he tried to keep locked away deep inside his mind. Beatrice had loved children. Her dream had always been to have a house full of them, noisy and chaotic. However, after Matthew was born, the doctors said she couldn't have any more children. The news devastated her, but she channeled all her love into her only son. When she was gone, she took with her not just her physical presence, but also the joy that had kept the house alive. Early in the morning, Thomas came downstairs, still sleepy after a restless night. When he reached the kitchen, he was surprised by the aroma of fresh coffee and the soft sound of music on the radio. Grace was already up, preparing breakfast while Emily slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle made of cushions. The atmosphere was completely different from the usual morning silence. "Good morning," she said, a little embarrassed. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to thank you for your hospitality." "You didn't have to," Thomas replied, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I would have on the street," she answered honestly, without melodrama or self-pity. "Thank you again. As soon as Emily wakes up, we'll get our things and won't bother you anymore." Thomas watched her for a few moments. There was a dignity about her that impressed him. Even in such a vulnerable situation, she maintained a firm posture, a direct gaze. She didn't ask for favors, only opportunities. "Where will you go?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Grace looked away, stirring her coffee with a spoon. "I don't know yet. I have some savings, but not enough for a new deposit. Maybe I can get a spot at a shelter until I find another solution." At that moment, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted their conversation. A boy of about 4, still in his pajamas and with disheveled hair, entered the kitchen. He stopped when he saw Grace looking at her with curiosity. "Good morning, Matthew," Thomas said. "This is Grace and that's Emily, her daughter. They spent the night here because of the rain." The boy approached shyly, looking first at Grace and then at the sleeping baby. A smile lit up his face. "She's so small," he commented, delighted. "Can I touch her?" "When she wakes up," Grace replied gently. "Right now she's dreaming of beautiful things." "How do you know?" Matthew asked, curious. "All children dream of beautiful things," she smiled. "That's why they sleep so peacefully." Matthew seemed to accept the explanation with the naturalness of children. He sat at the table and began to eat his breakfast, without taking his eyes off the baby. Thomas watched the interaction with interest. It had been a long time since he had seen his son so lively in the morning. The ringing phone broke the moment. Thomas answered, and his expression changed. It was Mrs. Miller, his mother-in-law. She was calling to say she would stop by later to see her grandson. Mrs. Miller's visits were always tense. Since Beatrice's passing, the relationship between them had deteriorated. She blamed him, even without saying it outright. When he hung up, Thomas looked worried. Grace noticed the change in mood and began to gather her things. "I think we'd better go now. We've overstayed our welcome." "No!" exclaimed Matthew, surprising them both. "I want to show Emily my toys when she wakes up." Thomas looked at his son, then at Grace and the baby. Something moved inside him, a decision that seemed to come more from the heart than from reason. "You said you have nowhere to stay," he began hesitantly. "My housekeeper quit 2 weeks ago and I haven't found a replacement yet. If you want, you can stay in the maid's room and work here. It would be temporary until you find something better." Grace stared at him, surprised. "Why would you do that?" "You don't even know me. I need someone to take care of the house and you need a place to stay with your daughter. It's an agreement, not charity," he explained, trying to sound practical. "And it seems Matthew has already taken a liking to you both." The boy smiled, confirming his father's words. Grace thought for a moment. It wasn't what she had planned, but in this situation it seemed like the best option. "I accept then. but I want to make it clear that it's temporary. As soon as I can save enough money for a new security deposit, I'll be on my way." "Deal," Thomas replied, extending his hand to seal the agreement. That same morning, Maria, the maid who came once a week for heavy cleaning, arrived and was surprised to find Grace in the kitchen. Thomas briefly explained the situation, omitting the more delicate details. "Mrs. Miller is not going to like this at all," Maria murmured when she was alone with Grace. "Mrs. Miller?" "The boss's mother-in-law. She's practically lived here since Mrs. Beatrice." Maria paused as if searching for the right words. "Since she passed, Mrs. Miller is very protective of her grandson and very suspicious of any woman who gets close to Mr. Evans." Grace nodded, understanding the complicated dynamic she was entering. "I'm not interested in anything other than work. I just need a safe place for my daughter until I can get back on my feet." Maria studied her for a moment, as if assessing her sincerity. "You seem like a good person. Just be careful. This house has its ghosts." Before Grace could ask what she meant, Matthew ran into the kitchen asking to see Emily, who had woken up. The conversation was interrupted, but Maria's words echoed in her mind. The hours passed quickly as Grace familiarized herself with the house routine. Thomas left for work, leaving her with basic instructions about Matthew's schedules and habits. The boy, normally shy and reserved with strangers according to Maria, was surprisingly open and talkative with Grace. He followed her around the house, asking about Emily, wanting to help with small tasks. "Do you know how to tell stories?" he asked while Grace was folding some clothes. "A little." "What kind of stories do you like?" "Adventure stories. Dad always tells them, but he's always tired." There was a note of sadness in his childish voice that did not go unnoticed by Grace. "I can try to tell you one tonight, before you go to sleep if your dad allows it." Matthew's face lit up with the promise. Grace felt a pang in her chest, seeing the child's happiness over something so simple. It was clear that despite all the material wealth, there were deep emotional needs in that house. Around 3 in the afternoon, just as Grace had put Emily down for a nap, the doorbell rang. When she opened the door, she was faced with an elegant lady with perfectly coiffed grey hair and an austere expression. Mrs. Vera Miller. Thomas's mother-in-law stared at her with obvious surprise and displeasure. "Who are you?" she asked bluntly, scanning Grace from head to toe. "I'm Grace, the new housekeeper," she replied, maintaining her composure. "Mr. Evans hired me this morning." Mrs. Miller frowned, entering the house without waiting for an invitation. "Hired? Just like that? Without checking references or background? That's not like Thomas. It's a temporary hire, ma'am. I can get Matthew if you're here to visit him." "No need." "I know where my grandson's room is," she replied dryly, heading for the stairs. Grace took a deep breath, trying not to be rattled by the treatment. She was used to being judged by her appearance, by her origin. She returned to the kitchen to prepare the afternoon snack, as Thomas had requested. Minutes later, Mrs. Miller appeared at the kitchen door, watching her work. There was something in her gaze that went beyond the normal suspicion of a stranger. "Where did you come from, young woman?" she asked in a tone that didn't hide her suspicion. "I'm from upstate New York, ma'am. I came to the city a few years ago looking for work." "And how did you meet Thomas?" Grace hesitated. She didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want to expose all her vulnerability. "We met by chance," she answered vaguely. "I was looking for a job and he needed someone for the house." Mrs. Miller approached, studying her more closely. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed something. "You have a daughter." It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. "Yes, Emily, she's 5 months old." "And the father?" The direct question caught Grace by surprise. "He's not in the picture." "Of course not," Mrs. Miller muttered with ill-disguised disdain. "Thomas has always been a kind-hearted but naive man. So I hope you're not taking advantage of that." Before Grace could respond, Matthew ran into the kitchen, rushing to hug his grandmother. Mrs. Miller's expression completely transformed in front of her grandson, becoming affectionate and warm. But her eyes, when they turned back to Grace, remained as cold as ice. The rest of the afternoon passed in a silent tension. Mrs. Miller didn't leave Matthew's side, watching Grace's every move around the house. When Emily woke up and started crying, Grace had to bring her into the kitchen while she prepared dinner. Matthew was enchanted with the baby, wanting to hold her, but Mrs. Miller pulled him away. We don't know what kind of diseases this child might have, she said loud enough for Grace to hear. Grace felt her face burn, but she remained silent. Her priority was to keep her job, at least until she found something better. She couldn't afford to confront her boss's mother-in-law, no matter how unfair she was. Thomas arrived around 7, looking exhausted. When he saw his mother-in-law in the living room with Matthew, his expression hardened even more. The greetings were formal, tense. "I see you've met Grace," he commented, taking off his coat. "Yes, I met your new hire," Mrs. Miller replied, the sarcasm evident. "A rather sudden decision, don't you think?" Thomas sighed. "Can we talk about this later?" "Of course." After Matthew is asleep, dinner was served in a heavy silence. Grace had prepared a simple but tasty meal. Matthew ate with appetite, praising the food. Mrs. Miller just poked at her plate, casting critical glances at Grace as she went back and forth from the kitchen. After dinner, Grace retired to the maid's room with Emily, giving the family space. Through the thin walls, she could hear the raised tone of the conversation in the living room, although she couldn't make out the exact words. It was clear that Mrs. Miller did not approve of her presence there. Later, after she had put Emily to sleep, a soft knock on the door surprised her. It was Matthew in his pajamas holding a storybook. "You promised," he reminded her with hopeful eyes. Grace smiled, letting him in. "Does your dad know you're here?" "He's arguing with Grandma," the boy replied with the raw honesty of children. "They won't notice I'm gone." Grace hesitated, but couldn't bring herself to send the boy back. She sat on the edge of the bed and began to read the story he had brought. Matthew listened, fascinated, asking questions and making comments. There was a hunger for attention in him that was almost palpable. When the story was over, he didn't want to leave. "Can I see Emily again?" "She's sleeping now. You can play more tomorrow. Promise you won't leave like Mom did?" The innocent question hit Grace like a blow. She swallowed hard, searching for the right words. "Matthew, I can't promise that. One day I'll have to go my own way, just as you'll go yours. But I can promise that while I'm here, I'll take care of you and tell you lots of stories." The boy seemed to accept the answer, although his gaze remained sad. Grace walked him back to his room, being careful not to be seen by Thomas or Mrs. Miller, who were still talking in the living room. Back in her room, Grace reflected on the day's events. In less than 24 hours, her life had taken a complete turn, from homeless to a housekeeper in a mansion. But despite the roof over her head and the momentary security, she felt she had entered a minefield of family tensions and secrets. Upstairs, the argument between Thomas and Mrs. Miller was finally coming to an end. "You barely know this woman, Thomas. How can you trust her with the house and your son?" Mrs. Miller exclaimed, exasperated. "She needs help and we need a housekeeper. It's a simple arrangement." "Simple? Don't you see what's happening here? She's young, pretty, with a small child. The perfect scenario to manipulate a lonely widower." Thomas stiffened at the word widower. Even after 2 years, he still couldn't get used to it. "It's nothing like that, Vera, and Matthew seems to like her." "Of course he likes her. He misses a mother figure. That's exactly what worries me. This woman might be taking advantage of my grandson's emotional needs." Thomas ran a hand over his face, too tired to continue arguing. "She's staying, at least for now. The decision has been made." Mrs. Miller stared at him, indignant. "Beatrice would be very disappointed in your naivety." The mention of his wife's name was like a stab wound. Thomas stood up abruptly. "It's late. You should go home." Reluctantly, Mrs. Miller left, but not before issuing a final warning. "I'll be keeping an eye on this woman, Thomas. I won't allow her to take advantage of you or tarnish my daughter's memory." When he was finally alone, Thomas poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in the dark living room. His mother-in-law's words echoed in his mind, mixed with the image of Grace and her baby in the rain. Had he done the right thing by taking them in? Or was he being naive, as Vera suggested? In the next room, Matthew looked out the window, watching the moon appear between the clouds after the storm. In his childish mind, he made a silent wish that Grace and Emily would stay forever. The house no longer felt so empty with them there. And in the maid's room, Grace hugged Emily as she fell asleep, grateful for the shelter, but uneasy, with the feeling that there was more to this family than met the eye. Maria's words about ghosts in the house now made more sense. The night wore on, wrapping the mansion in shadows and silence. as each of its inhabitants carried their own secrets and hopes for the next day. The following days were a period of adjustment for everyone in the Evans mansion. Grace established an organized routine, efficiently managing the house while juggling the care of Emily. Matthew followed her everywhere, fascinated by the baby and the warm presence Grace brought to the once silent home. Thomas, initially distant and formal, began to notice the small changes. The aroma of fresh coffee in the morning, flowers from the garden now in vases around the house, the sound of laughter coming from the kitchen. Most of all, he noticed the transformation in his son. Matthew, once quiet and introspective, now talked non-stop about the stories Grace told, about how Emily gripped his finger tightly, about the drawings he made to show them. "Looks like you've won over a fan," Thomas commented one evening as Grace served dinner. Matthew had already eaten and was in his room playing before bed. "He's a special boy," she replied with a sincere smile. "He has a huge heart." Thomas watched her for a moment. There was something in the way Grace moved about the house with naturalness and respect that intrigued him. She didn't behave like a typical employee, but she also showed no interest in overstepping the established boundaries. "How was your day?" she asked, breaking the silence. The simple question caught him off guard. It had been a long time since anyone had shown genuine interest in his daily life. "Exhausting. We're launching a new app, and the investors are pushing for immediate results. It must be tough dealing with so much pressure." Thomas smiled slightly. "You have no idea, but it's better than the alternative." "What alternative?" "Staying at home alone with my thoughts." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Grace just nodded, understanding without forcing the conversation. There was a wisdom in her that didn't match her age or position. The phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was Mrs. Miller, as always at the same time, to check on her grandson. Thomas took the call in his office, leaving Grace alone in the kitchen. The relationship between Thomas and his mother-in-law was an enigma to Grace. There was resentment, guilt, something unresolved that hung in the air whenever Mrs. Miller was mentioned. Her visits became more frequent after Grace started working at the house. She would arrive unannounced with gifts for Matthew and suspicious glances for Grace. Was she always like this? Grace asked Maria during one of the cleaners' weekly visits. Mrs. Miller. Not always. She changed a lot after her daughter passed, Maria replied, lowering her voice. She was controlling, yes, but not bitter. Mrs. Beatrice was the light of her life. When she lost her, the cleaner paused, choosing her words. Well, she needed someone to blame. And she blamed Mr. Evans. Mostly him. She thinks he didn't take good care of her daughter, that he should have seen the signs. Signs of what? Maria seemed to realize she had said too much. It's not my place to talk about it. Just be careful with Mrs. Miller. She doesn't trust you and will do everything possible to get you out of here. Maria's words proved true in the following days. Small incidents began to occur. Valuables would be moved and later found among Grace's belongings. Food would disappear from the pantry, followed by insinuations that she was taking it home. Anonymous phone calls questioning her past. Grace realized what was happening, but chose not to confront it. She needed the job, the roof over her head. Emily finally had a safe place to sleep, guaranteed food. But something beyond necessity was beginning to tie Grace to that house. The genuine affection of Matthew, the slow but steady evolution of her relationship with Thomas, the feeling of building something meaningful there. One Saturday afternoon, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Grace was in the garden with Emily and Matthew. The baby, now more alert and active, babbled as the boy tried to make her smile with funny faces. Thomas watched the scene from the porch, with an expression that mixed nostalgia and something more indefinable. "She likes me," Matthew said proudly, as Emily grabbed his finger and let out a happy squeal. "Of course she does," Grace replied. "Who wouldn't?" The boy suddenly became serious. "Did Mommy like me?" The question caught Grace by surprise. She glanced quickly at Thomas, unsure how to proceed, but he seemed as disconcerted as she was. "I'm sure she did, Matthew. Mothers always love their children, even when they're not here anymore." "Then why did she go away?" Grace's heart ached. Before she could formulate an answer, Thomas approached and sat beside his son. "Your mother didn't want to go, Matthew. She loved you more than anything in the world. Sometimes people have to leave even when they don't want to." Matthew absorbed his father's words in thoughtful silence. After a few moments, He went back to playing with Emily, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. But Grace noticed the tension in Thomas's shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly. Later, when Matthew was in bed, Grace found Thomas in the office, an untouched drink in front of him, his gaze lost in the photos on his desk. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, stopping at the door. "I just wanted to let you know I've tidied up the kitchen and Matthew is asleep." Thomas nodded without looking at her. "Thank you, Grace. You can go get some rest." She should have left, but something kept her there. "Are you okay?" The simple question seemed to break something inside him. Thomas looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't know how to talk to him about his mother. I don't know what to say, how to explain." His voice faltered. Grace hesitantly entered the office, sitting in the chair across from him. "Matthew is smart. He'll understand when he's ready. What if I'm not ready? Beatrice was—" He broke off, taking a sip of his drink. "She was everything to us. When she was gone, she took a part of me that I'll never get back." The ensuing silence was heavy with emotion. Grace waited, respecting the moment. "She suffered from postpartum depression," Thomas continued, as if needing to vent. "After Matthew was born, something changed. She became distant, sad. We tried everything. Therapy, medication, changes in routine. Nothing worked. I should have seen she was getting worse. I should have done more. You can't blame yourself. Depression is a complex illness. Mrs. Miller blames me. To her, I failed to protect her daughter, and maybe she's right." Grace hesitated before speaking. "Losing someone we love is incredibly painful. Sometimes we need to blame someone to make sense of something that has no explanation." Thomas looked at her in surprise, as if seeing something new in her. "You speak like someone who's been through it." She looked away. "We all carry our own losses." Before he could ask more, the phone rang. It was Mrs. Miller again, confirming Sunday lunch. Grace took the opportunity to leave, leaving him to his conversation. The next day, Mrs. Miller arrived early, bringing sweets for Matthew, and news about a more experienced and qualified housekeeper she had found. The hint was clear. Grace kept busy in the kitchen, preparing lunch while listening to fragments of the conversation in the living room. "She comes from a very respected family, Thomas. She has excellent references," Mrs. Miller was saying, "and she comes with no baggage or complications. She would be perfect for you." "We already have a housekeeper, Vera," Thomas replied, his irritation clear in his voice. "And Matthew likes her. Matthew is a child. He doesn't know what's best for him. And how long do you think this girl will stay? She herself said it's temporary." Grace felt a tightness in her chest. It was true, she had made it clear her stay was temporary. But now the idea of leaving that house, leaving Matthew, leaving Thomas caused a pain she hadn't expected to feel. Lunch proceeded in a tense atmosphere. Mrs. Miller made a point of correcting every small mistake Grace made, from the temperature of the food to the way it was served. Thomas seemed increasingly irritated, while Matthew watched the dynamic between the adults in confusion. After the meal, as Grace cleared the plates, Matthew approached her. "Grandma said you're leaving soon. Is it true?" The boy spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Grace felt all eyes on her. "One day, yes, Matthew. But don't worry about that now, okay?" "I don't want you to go," he stated, with the brutal honesty of children. "I want you and Emily to stay forever." Mrs. Miller quickly intervened. "Matthew, dear, Grace has her own life. She can't stay here forever. But we'll find someone even better to take care of you, I promise." The boy looked at his grandmother, then at Grace, and finally at his father. "Are you going to let her leave, Daddy?" Thomas seemed caught between two opposing forces. "That's not just up to me, son. Grace decides her own life." Matthew didn't seem satisfied with the answer. He ran off to his room, leaving an uncomfortable silence behind. "See what you've done?" Mrs. Miller accused, turning to Grace. "You're confusing the boy's mind, creating expectations." "I never did anything of the sort," Grace defended herself, keeping her voice calm. "I always made it clear to Matthew that my stay here is temporary. But you got close to him, let him get attached." "That's, cruel," Thomas intervened. "That's enough, Vera. It's not fair to blame Grace for being kind to Matthew." "Kind? She's manipulating both of you. Don't you see what's happening? This woman appeared out of nowhere with a sob story. And now she's trying to replace my daughter. I never had that intention," Grace protested, feeling tears burn in her eyes. "I would never disrespect the memory of Matthew's mother." "Then prove it," Mrs. Miller challenged. Leave this house. Stop confusing my grandson. Stop seducing my son-in-law with your damsel in distress act. Thomas stood up, furious. That's enough. You're going too far, Vera. Me? Look at her, Thomas. Don't you notice anything familiar? The same height, the same features, even the same tone of voice. She's practically a copy of Beatrice. The words fell like a thunderbolt. Grace, shocked, looked at Thomas, who had turned pale. Was it true? Did she resemble his late wife? That's ridiculous, Thomas muttered, but his tone was unconvincing. Grace felt her stomach sink. Was that the reason he took her in? The reason Matthew got attached to her so quickly? Not for who she was, but for who she reminded them of. Excuse me, she said, her voice trembling before retreating to her room. Emily slept peacefully in her makeshift crib, oblivious to the unfolding drama. Grace sat on the bed trying to organize her thoughts. Maybe Mrs. Miller was right. Maybe her presence was confusing Matthew, preventing him from properly processing the loss of his mother. And what about Thomas? Was he unconsciously trying to replace his wife? A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Thomas. May I come in? He asked, his expression grim. Grace nodded, standing up. I wanted to apologize for Vera's behavior. She crossed every line. It's not just that, is it? Grace questioned, facing him. Is she right about the resemblance? Thomas hesitated, looking away. There's a certain physical resemblance, yes, but you and Beatrice are completely different people. Is that why you let me stay? Because I reminded you of her? At first I was surprised by the resemblance, yes. But that's not why I offered you the job. It was because of how you faced the situation, with dignity, even while being vulnerable. And later, it was because of what I saw you do for this house, for Matthew. Grace wanted to believe him, but Mrs. Miller's words had planted a seed of doubt. Maybe it's best if I look for another place, she suggested, her voice low. I don't want to be a source of conflict. No, Thomas's response was immediate. Don't let Vera drive you away. Matthew would never forgive me, and neither would I. Something in the way he said those last words made Grace's heart race. There was more there than just concern for the housekeeper or his son's feelings. Stay, he pleaded more softly. At least until you find something genuinely better. Not just a place to run away to. Before she could answer, Emily woke up, crying. Thomas stepped back, giving her space to care for the baby. Think about what I said, he said before leaving. This house has improved so much since you arrived. In the following weeks, the tension in the Evans mansion escalated. Mrs. Miller intensified her visits and her attempts to find reasons to discredit Grace. She hired a private investigator to dig into the young woman's past, hoping to uncover some dark secret, some proof that she wasn't who she claimed to be. Meanwhile, the relationship between Grace and Thomas evolved subtly and almost imperceptibly. Small gestures, longer conversations after dinner, a genuine interest in each other's lives. Nothing explicit, nothing declared, just a growing connection that neither of them dared to name. Matthew, for his part, flourished with Grace's attention. His grades at school improved. He became more sociable, more confident. His teacher even commented on the positive change during a school meeting, asking Thomas what had happened. "We have a new person in the house," was all he replied with a discreet smile. One particularly hot afternoon, while Emily was sleeping and Matthew was at school, Grace found herself alone in the mansion. She took the opportunity to organize some things in the boys' room when she noticed a box partially hidden under the bed. Curious, she pulled it out to see what it was. Inside, she found several drawings made by Matthew, drawings of her, of Emily, of all of them together as a family. One in particular caught her eye. It showed 4 people holding hands, a man, a woman, a boy, and a baby. Above the woman, a halo was drawn. "My family," read the caption in childish handwriting. "Daddy, Grace, me, and Emily, and Mommy in heaven watching over us." Grace felt tears in her eyes. Matthew didn't see her as a replacement for his mother, as Mrs. Miller feared. He included her in his vision of family without erasing Beatrice's memory. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Miller's voice startled her. The older woman was standing at the bedroom door, looking at her suspiciously. "Just tidying up Matthew's room," Grace replied, quickly putting the drawing back in the box. "And snooping through his belongings." "I see." Mrs. Miller entered the room, grabbing the box. "What do we have here?" Before Grace could explain, Thomas's mother-in-law was already examining the drawings. Her expression changed with each image she saw, becoming darker and darker. "Do you see what you're doing?" She accused, brandishing one of the drawings. "You're erasing my daughter's memory." "I never did that, Mrs. Miller. Matthew knows very well who his mother is." "Does he really? Or is he confused because you're taking her place?" "Look at this!" She showed the drawing Grace had just seen. "You're replacing Beatrice just as you planned from the beginning." "I didn't plan any of this," Grace protested. "I never intended to take anyone's place." "Then why did you come to this house? Why, of all the houses in New York City, did you knock on this particular door?" "It was a coincidence. I was desperate with a baby in my arms in the rain." "Coincidence?" Mrs. Miller laughed humorlessly. "Nothing about you is a coincidence, I'm sure. There's something you're not telling. A specific reason for choosing this family." Grace began to feel frightened by the intensity of the woman's gaze. There was something almost manic in her determination to find a conspiracy where none existed. "You're mistaken," she stated, trying to remain calm. "I have no hidden motive for being here." "We'll see," Mrs. Miller replied, putting one of the drawings in her purse. "My investigator is getting close to something. When I find out what you really want, there will be no place for you in this house." After Mrs. Miller left, Grace remained in Matthew's room, trembling. The woman's accusations were absurd, but they had touched a raw nerve. It was true that her arrival at that specific house was not entirely accidental. There was something she hadn't told anyone, not even Thomas, a secret she had carried for months, ever since she discovered her pregnancy. That night, when Thomas arrived, he immediately noticed that something was wrong. Grace was quiet, distant, her eyes revealing that she had been crying. "What happened?" he asked, concerned. "Your mother-in-law was here today," she replied simply. Thomas sighed. "What did she do this time?" Grace told him about the drawings, about the accusations. She omitted the part about the investigator, not wanting to alarm him further. "She's obsessed with the idea that I came to this house with ulterior motives." Thomas sat beside her at the kitchen table. "And did you?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean? But did you choose this house for a specific reason, Grace? Was there something you were looking for here?" She stared at him, unable to completely hide her shock. "Why are you asking this now? Do you suspect me too?" "It's not suspicion," he replied softly. "It's just, sometimes I feel there's something unsaid between us. Something you're holding back." Grace looked away. "We all have secrets, Thomas. Things we're not ready to share." "Fair enough. But I hope one day you'll trust me enough to tell me yours." The sincerity in his voice made Grace almost confess right then and there. But she wasn't ready, not yet. What would she tell him? That she had known Beatrice? That she knew more about his wife than she had ever revealed? That her arrival at that house was no mere twist of fate? "One day, maybe," was all she could manage to reply. The subject was interrupted by the arrival of Matthew, excited to show off a school project he had made. The evening proceeded as usual, but something had shifted between Grace and Thomas. A question hung in the air, unvoiced but present in every glance, in every silence. Days later, Grace found an envelope in her room. Inside were photos. Photos of her entering the psychiatric hospital, where Beatrice had been treated before she passed. Photos of her talking to a nurse from the facility. Along with the images, a handwritten note. "I know you knew her. I know what you're hiding. Leave this house or everyone will know." Grace's heart raced. Who had gotten those photos? Mrs. Miller and her investigator, certainly. But how did they find out? She had been so careful. That same night, while putting Emily to sleep, she heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. Going down to check, she found Maria rummaging through the drawers. "Maria? What are you doing here at this hour?" The cleaner jumped, clearly caught by surprise. "Oh, Grace, you scared me. I forgot my phone today and came back to get it." Grace noticed the woman's nervousness, the way she avoided her gaze. "In the silverware drawer? I thought it might have fallen in there when I was cleaning," Maria replied unconvincingly. "But I'm leaving now. It's late." As the cleaner hurried out, Grace examined the drawer. Nothing seemed out of place. But why would Maria be snooping there? The feeling of being watched, investigated, pursued, intensified. Who was really behind these intimidation attempts? Mrs. Miller? Or was there someone else interested in her past? The next morning, while preparing coffee, Grace noticed something odd about Matthew's cereal box. The seal seemed to have been opened and reclosed. As a precaution, she threw the contents away and opened a new box. The coincidences were beginning to pile up alarmingly. Small incidents, objects out of place, the constant feeling of being watched. Grace was starting to fear not just for herself, but especially for Emily. What if someone tried to hurt her through her daughter? It was in this climate of growing anxiety that Thomas surprised her with an invitation. "I'm thinking of taking Matthew to the beach next weekend. Just the two of us, some father-son time. But he insists that you and Emily should come too." Grace hesitated. "I don't know if that's appropriate, Thomas. I'm your employee. You're more than that, and you know it. You're part of this family now, whether you like it or not." The words hit her deeply. Family. It was what she secretly wished for, what she feared she would never have again. "Besides," he continued, "it would be good to get out of this house for a few days. Matthew needs new memories, a change of scenery." She knew he was right. The boy needed positive experiences, moments of pure joy without the constant shadow of the past. And she also needed a break from the tensions of the mansion. "All right," she finally agreed. "We'll go." The news of the trip did not please Mrs. Miller as expected. She appeared at the mansion the day before their departure, determined to prevent Grace from accompanying the family. "This is completely inappropriate, Thomas. What will people think? A widower traveling with his housekeeper and her baby. I don't care what they think, Vera. Matthew wants them to come, and that's enough for me. And what would Beatrice think of this? Of you taking another woman to where you used to go as a family?" The mention of Beatrice was still like a blow to Thomas. Grace, who was packing Emily's bags in her room, could hear the argument in the living room. "Beatrice would want Matthew to be happy," Thomas replied, his voice firm. "That's all she ever wanted for him. Happy with a replacement. With an imposter who looks like her but doesn't even come close." "Enough, Vera. I will not allow you to speak of Grace like that. She has been a blessing to this house, to Matthew, to me." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Grace held her breath, waiting for Mrs. Miller's response. "So that's it." The older woman's voice sounded controlled, dangerously calm. "You're falling for her. For this woman we know nothing about, who showed up out of nowhere with a story that's too convenient to—" "That's not what's happening," Thomas protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "No? Then why are you letting her take Beatrice's place? Confusing Matthew, erasing the memories of his own mother. No one is taking Beatrice's place. No one could, even if they wanted to. And yet you're allowing this opportunist to get closer and closer. And worse, you're falling into her trap." Grace couldn't listen anymore. She picked up Emily and went out into the garden through the back, needing fresh air. Mrs. Miller's words hurt her more than she wanted to admit, especially because they touched on her own insecurities. Was she really trying to take Beatrice's place? Was she confusing Matthew? And what about Thomas? Was he really developing feelings for her, or just projecting the image of his lost wife onto her? Sitting on a bench under the shade of a tree, Grace looked at Emily asleep in her arms. Her daughter, so small and innocent, depended completely on her. Every decision she made affected not only her life, but also Emily's future. And now it seemed her actions were also affecting Matthew and Thomas. The responsibility was overwhelming. The sound of approaching footsteps alerted her to someone's arrival. It was Thomas, looking tired and dejected. "Is she gone?" Grace asked without looking up. "Yes, finally." He sat beside her on the bench. "I'm sorry you had to hear that. It's hard not to hear when she makes a point of speaking so loudly." Thomas smiled sadly. Vera was never known for her subtlety. "She's right about some things, Thomas. It's not appropriate for me to go on this trip. I'm your employee, not part of the family. That's not true, and you know it. Do I? What am I, then? Define my role in this house." The direct question caught him off guard. Thomas looked at Emily, then at Grace, searching for the right words. "You are important to Matthew, to this house. To me." "Important how?" "I can't explain it, Grace. I just know that before you arrived, this house was just a place where we slept. Now it feels like a home again." She absorbed his words, feeling their weight. There was truth there, a truth they had both been avoiding. "I'm scared," she finally confessed. "Scared that Mrs. Miller is right, that I'm confusing Matthew, that you're seeing someone in me that I'm not." "I'm not," he stated with conviction. I know exactly who you are, Grace, and it has nothing to do with Beatrice. You are completely different people. What I feel for you is different from anything I've ever felt before." Her heart sped up with the near confession, but the fear still lingered. The fear of her secret, of how he would react when he found out. "There are things about me you don't know," she said, her voice low. "Things that could change your opinion. We all have secrets, Grace. When you're ready to share yours, I'll be here to listen." He reached out, gently touching her face. The gesture, so simple and yet so intimate, broke something inside Grace. The tears she had held back for so long finally came to the surface. "It's okay," Thomas whispered, wrapping her in a half-hug, careful not to wake Emily. "It's okay." They stayed like that for some time, in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Night was falling over the garden, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a scene of momentary peace, a break in the storm that was gathering around them. What neither of them knew was that they were not alone in the garden. From a second-floor window, Mrs. Miller watched the scene with a mixture of anger and determination. In her hands she held her phone, having just made an important call. "Yes, I'm sure," she was saying to the person on the other end of the line. "It's her, the girl who used to visit Beatrice in the hospital. I need to know exactly what their relationship was, and I need to know before it's too late." The answer from the other side seemed to satisfy her. With one last look at the couple in the garden, Mrs. Miller moved away from the window, a plan already forming in her stubborn mind. If Thomas couldn't see the danger Grace represented, she would have to force his eyes open, whatever it took. The trip to Montauk brought temporary relief from the tensions that had been building in the Evans mansion. Young Matthew, ecstatic at the chance to show Grace and Emily his favorite spots, ran along the sand with renewed energy, pulling the young woman by the hand to see every shell, every rock formation he considered special. Thomas followed a few steps behind, carrying the baby in his arms, his face more relaxed than it had been in years. "Here, Grace. This is where Dad and I build sandcastles," the boy shouted, pointing to a stretch near the rocks. "Mom always brought lemonade when we were done." Grace exchanged a quick glance with Thomas, unsure how to respond. It was the first time Matthew had mentioned Beatrice so naturally, without apparent sadness, just as part of a happy memory. "Lemonade on the beach must be delicious," she replied, smiling. "I think we brought some in the cooler. Yes, Mom loved lemons. She said they were like little pieces of sunshine you can eat." Matthew spoke naturally, starting to dig in the sand. "Do you like lemons too, Grace?" "I love them, especially when they're nice and sweet." Thomas approached, sitting on the sand with Emily. The baby, now almost 6 months old, babbled excitedly at the sight of the sea. "We're going to build the biggest castle this beach has ever seen," he said, starting to help his son. "Emily can be the princess who lives in it." The four of them spent the morning building an elaborate sandcastle, complete with towers, moats, and even a small flag made from a twig and a leaf. To any outside observer, they would look like an ordinary family enjoying a sunny day. And perhaps that's what bothered Grace the most, how natural, how right it felt, even knowing it was built on secrets and half-truths. At the hotel, a small family-run establishment overlooking the sea, Thomas had booked 2 connecting suites. The proximity allowed Matthew to move freely between the rooms, but maintained a semblance of formality that Thomas deemed appropriate. He was still her employer, after all, even if they both knew the relationship had evolved into something more complex. On the second night of the trip, after putting the children to bed, Grace and Thomas met on the small balcony connecting the rooms. The full moon illuminated the sea, creating an almost magical scene. "Matthew couldn't stop talking about you today," Thomas commented, offering her a glass of wine. "Miss Grace this, Miss Grace that." "I think you've won a fan for life," she smiled, accepting the drink. "He's special. He has a huge heart." "Like his mother," Thomas said almost unconsciously. Realizing what he'd said, he quickly corrected himself. "Sorry, I didn't mean to compare you two. It's just that—" "It's okay," Grace interrupted gently. "You don't have to apologize for talking about her. Beatrice will always be a part of your lives." Thomas studied her for a moment, intrigued. "You talk about her so naturally. Most people avoid the subject, as if it's some kind of taboo." "Death shouldn't be a taboo," Grace replied, looking at the horizon. "Especially for Matthew. He needs to know it's normal to remember his mother, to talk about her, to keep her memory alive. Did you lose someone important too? Thomas's question was gentle, without pressure. Grace hesitated before answering. My mother, when I was a little older than Matthew. I grew up with my father, who did his best but never knew how to handle the subject. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. She took a sip of wine, gathering courage for what she would say next. Thomas, there's something I need to tell you. About me, about how I ended up at your door that night. His expression turned serious. I'm listening. Before she could continue, Emily's cry interrupted the moment. Grace stood up immediately. I need to go check on her. We'll continue later. Thomas nodded, hiding his frustration. Once again, the moment of truth had been postponed. The next morning, during breakfast on the hotel restaurant's terrace, Matthew was unusually quiet, picking at his food without interest. Is everything okay, son? Thomas asked, concerned. The boy looked up, thoughtful. Daddy? Grandma said Grace is leaving soon. Is it true? The question caught both adults by surprise. Grace swallowed hard, leaving the answer to Thomas. Well, Matthew, Grace came to work with us for a while, but one day she might want to follow her own path. But why? Doesn't she like us? Of course I like you, Grace intervened, moved. You're very important to me. Then why are you leaving? Why does everyone leave? The boy's voice trembled slightly. Mommy left, Aunt Laura left, now you're leaving too. Grace's heart tightened. Laura was the former housekeeper, who had worked with the family for years until she retired a few months before Grace's arrival. For a child who had already lost his mother, each departure reinforced the feeling of abandonment. Matthew, she began, choosing her words carefully. Some people have to leave even if they don't want to. Others follow different paths, but that doesn't mean they stop liking you. And others, she hesitated, looking at Thomas. Others might stay longer than they initially thought. The boy's eyes lit up. Will you stay? Forever? I can't promise forever, Matthew. No one can. But I promise not to go anywhere in the near future, okay? The boy seemed to accept the answer, returning to his food with more enthusiasm. Thomas, however, looked at Grace intently, as if trying to decipher the true meaning of her words. The rest of the day passed in a lighter mood. They visited the Montauk Point Lighthouse, took a boat tour, took pictures in front of the sunset. It was as if, for a few hours, they could pretend the complications didn't exist, that they were just people enjoying each other's company without the weight of the past or the threat of the future. On the last night, after Matthew finally fell asleep, exhausted after a day full of activities, Grace and Thomas returned to the balcony. The atmosphere between them had subtly changed since the interrupted conversation the night before. There was an expectation in the air, a sense that something important needed to be said. You were going to tell me something yesterday, Thomas reminded her, breaking the silence. Grace nodded nervously. Yes, I was. Do you still want to tell me? She took a deep breath. It was now or never. If she wanted to build something real with Thomas and Matthew, it couldn't be based on lies or omissions. Thomas, my arrival at your house that rainy night wasn't completely accidental. He frowned, confused. What do you mean? I knew who you were. I knew where you lived. I knew Beatrice. The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Thomas was paralyzed, his eyes fixed on her. How? Was all he could ask. We met at the psychiatric hospital where she was staying. I worked there as a cleaner. We weren't close friends, but we talked sometimes. She talked a lot about you and Matthew, showed me pictures. Thomas stood up, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of agitation. This doesn't make sense. Why did you never mention this before? Why did you come to my house and pretend not to know me? Because I was afraid of how you would react. And because it wasn't planned. I really was desperate that night, with Emily in my arms, with nowhere to go. I recognized your house from the pictures Beatrice had shown me, and I made an impulsive decision. I didn't expect you to let me in, much less offer me a job. Thomas stared at her with a mixture of shock and betrayal. All this time, you knew about us, about Beatrice, and you never said a word. I tried several times, but it never seemed like the right moment, and the longer I waited, the harder it became to confess. What else do you know? What else are you hiding? His voice had a tone Grace had never heard before. Hard, accusatory. Nothing relevant, she replied, feeling she was losing ground quickly. Just what Beatrice told me in our brief conversations. She loved you both very much, Thomas. She spoke of you and Matthew as the center of her universe. Then why did she leave us? The question came out as a choked cry, heavy with unresolved pain. Grace felt tears in her eyes. You know why? The depression consumed her, Thomas. It wasn't her choice. It wasn't anyone's fault. He turned his back, unable to face her. I need to process this. I need to be alone. Without another word, Thomas went into his room, leaving Grace alone on the balcony with a heavy heart. She knew she had taken a huge risk by revealing the truth, but she didn't expect the reaction to be so negative. She had the feeling that something precious had been broken, something that perhaps couldn't be repaired. The next morning, the mood during the drive back to New York City was completely different from the joy of the previous days. Matthew, sensitive to the adult's mood swings, remained unusually quiet. Thomas drove in silence, answering only what was strictly necessary when his son asked a question. Grace, in the back seat with Emily, felt a lump in her throat that wouldn't go away. When they arrived at the mansion, they were greeted by a triumphant-looking Mrs. Miller. She had been informed by Maria that they would be back that day and made sure to be present. "How was the trip?" she asked, her tone falsely friendly. Her eyes, however, went from Thomas to Grace, immediately noticing the tension between them. "Great, Grandma," Matthew replied, showing her the shells he had collected. "We swam, built sandcastles, had ice cream every day." "That's wonderful, dear. Why don't you take your shells to your room while I talk to your father?" The boy obeyed, but not before casting a worried glance at Grace, who tried to smile reassuringly. As soon as they were alone, Mrs. Miller turned to Thomas. "What happened? You look like you've come back from a funeral, not a vacation." "It's nothing, Vera. We're just tired from the trip." "Don't take me for a fool, Thomas. I know that look." "What did she do?" Before he could answer, Grace intervened. "Excuse me, I'm going to take Emily to rest. It was a long trip for her, too." As she climbed the stairs, she could feel Mrs. Miller's eyes drilling into her back like daggers. The feeling of being watched, judged, was almost palpable. In her room, Grace unpacked haphazardly, her hands trembling. Emily, sensing her mother's nervousness, began to cry. Grace picked her up, rocking her gently. "It's okay, my love. It's going to be okay." But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The truth was, nothing seemed okay at that moment. She had the distinct feeling that her position in that house, her relationship with Thomas and Matthew, everything was hanging by a thread that Mrs. Miller seemed determined to cut. The following days passed in a tense routine. Thomas avoided being alone with Grace, leaving early for work and coming back late. When it was unavoidable for them to meet, their conversation was limited to the bare necessities. Matthew, confused by the change, sought Grace's company more and more, as if afraid she would disappear at any moment. Mrs. Miller, for her part, intensified her presence in the house. She showed up daily, bringing newspaper clippings with job ads for housekeepers, subtly suggesting to Grace that her time there was running out. When Thomas was present, she acted with an exaggerated cordiality, as if everything were perfectly normal. A week after their return from the trip, Grace found an envelope in her room. Inside were more photographs, this time showing her in an intense conversation with a woman in front of the psychiatric hospital. The woman, whom Grace immediately recognized as Renata, the head nurse who had cared for Beatrice, seemed to be handing her something. Along with the photos, a new note. "I know you received something from Beatrice. I know you're hiding more than you've admitted. Your time is running out. If you don't leave on your own, Thomas will know everything." Grace's heart raced. Who was doing this? Mrs. Miller was the obvious suspect. But how could she have gotten those specific photos? And what did they mean by received something from Beatrice? That same night, as Grace was putting Matthew to bed, a routine Thomas hadn't forbidden, perhaps not wanting to upset his son further, the boy asked an unexpected question. "Grace, did you know my mom?" She froze, the storybook suspended in mid-air. "Why do you ask that, Matthew?" "I heard Grandma talking to Daddy. She said you knew Mommy and never told us." Grace felt a lump in her throat. Lying to Thomas had been hard enough. Lying to this child would be impossible. "Yes, Matthew. I knew your mom. We weren't close friends, but we talked sometimes." "What was she like?" The boy's eyes shone with curiosity and hope. "She was very beautiful, like you. And she talked about you all the time, showed your pictures to everyone." She said you were the best gift she had ever received in her life. Matthew smiled, absorbing the words like a precious treasure. Did she smile? In my memories, she hardly ever smiled. The child's raw honesty broke Grace's heart. Sometimes she smiled, yes, especially when she talked about you. Why didn't you tell us before that you knew her? Because I was scared, Matthew. Scared that your dad and you would be angry with me for not telling you sooner. The boy thought for a moment, processing the information in a way only children can, without judgment, just curiosity. Is Daddy mad at you now? Is that why you don't talk anymore? Your dad is confused. Sometimes people need time to think when they find out new things. Like when I found out Santa Claus isn't real and I didn't talk to anyone for 3 days. Grace couldn't help but smile at the comparison. Something like that, yes. But you're still going to stay here, right? You promised. She hesitated. She had promised not to leave in the near future, but circumstances had changed drastically. I'll stay as long as your dad allows, Matthew. That's all I can promise now. The answer didn't seem to satisfy him completely, but he didn't insist. After the story, Grace kissed him on the forehead and was about to leave when he called her again. Grace? Did Mommy leave anything for me before she went away? The question caught her off guard. Why do you ask that? Grandma said Mommy left something important, and that you took it. She was very angry when she said it. So that was it. Mrs. Miller suspected that Beatrice had left something with Grace, something she now possessed. But what? The only interactions she had had with Beatrice were casual conversations, nothing that would justify Mrs. Miller's obsession, unless... A sudden thought struck Grace. The last time she saw Beatrice, 2 days before she passed, the woman had handed her an envelope. If something happens to me, give this to Thomas, she had said. Grace never saw the contents, but she kept the envelope, respecting the request. With the shock of the news of Beatrice's passing, the confusion at the hospital, and her own dismissal weeks later, the envelope ended up stored among her belongings, almost forgotten until now. No, Matthew, your mom didn't leave anything for you, she answered truthfully, as the envelope was intended for Thomas, not the boy. But maybe she left something for your dad. She left the room, her mind racing. She needed to find that envelope to see what it contained. Maybe therein lay the answer to Mrs. Miller's obsessive behavior, to her determination to drive her away from the Evans family. In her room, Grace rummaged through her boxes, the ones that had been brought from the small studio apartment where she used to live. The envelope wasn't among her clothes, nor among her documents. Where could she have put something so important? As she searched, a noise at the door startled her. She turned to find Thomas standing there, watching her with an unreadable expression. Matthew told me you talked, he said without preamble. About Beatrice? Grace stood up, nervous. Yes, he asked directly. I couldn't lie to him. No, you couldn't. Thomas took a step into the room, still keeping his distance. What are you looking for so desperately? She hesitated. Telling him about the envelope was risking the fragile trust that remained between them once again. But keeping more secrets would only make things worse. Beatrice gave me something shortly before she passed, an envelope for you. With everything that happened, I ended up putting it away, and to be honest, I almost forgot about it. But now, with Mrs. Miller so obsessed with finding out what Beatrice left me, I realize it must be important. Thomas stared at her with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. And you never thought it relevant to give this to me? You kept it for almost 3 years? It wasn't intentional, Thomas. I wasn't even working at the hospital when it happened. And then I lost contact with everyone there. When I ran into you that rainy night, I was so desperate, so focused on surviving with Emily, that I didn't even remember. He shook his head, incredulous. Another thing you conveniently forgot to mention. I'm trying to fix that now, Grace defended herself. I'm looking for the envelope. And what's in this mysterious envelope that my wife gave you instead of leaving with me? I don't know. I never opened it. Thomas laughed humorously. So you expect me to believe that? That you kept a mysterious envelope for years without ever being curious enough to look inside? Believe what you want, Thomas. I'm tired of trying to prove my honesty. The frustration in Grace's voice was palpable. I'm only looking for it because maybe it explains your mother-in-law's obsession with me. My mother-in-law has reasons to be suspicious of you. You show up out of nowhere with a convenient story. You get close to my son, you gain my trust. And now I find out you knew Beatrice, that she gave you something important. What else are you hiding, Grace? The accusation hit her like a slap. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Nothing else. I'm not hiding anything else. Then why did you come to this specific house that night? Of all the houses in New York, why mine? I already told you. I recognized the house from the pictures Beatrice had shown me. I was desperate with no options. And of all the people she knew, she chose to entrust something important to a hospital cleaner she barely talked to. The incredulity in his voice was cutting. Maybe because I was the only one who really listened to her. Who didn't treat her like a disturbed patient? Grace exploded, unable to contain her emotion. Do you have any idea what it was like for her in there? Lonely, separated from her son, her husband, feeling like a failure as a mother. Maybe she chose me because I had no expectations of her. I didn't judge her for being sick. The words came out harsher than she intended, filled with a pain that was not just for Beatrice, but also for herself, for all she had lost and sacrificed. Thomas's expression changed, the anger giving way to something closer to helplessness. I visited her every day, he said, his voice low. I brought Matthew whenever the doctors allowed. I did everything I could. I know you did. She knew it too. She's not blaming you, Thomas. No one is. Grace approached hesitantly. Beatrice was sick. It wasn't your fault or hers. Something seemed to break in Thomas's rigid posture. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time since she had met him, he seemed truly vulnerable. When you find it, I want to see that envelope. Of course, Grace quickly agreed. I'll keep looking. He nodded, turning to leave. At the door, he paused briefly. Matthew adores you, you know. Since that first morning, when he found you in the kitchen, I've never seen him connect so quickly with someone. The words, spoken without looking at her, sounded like a concession, a small acknowledgement that, despite everything, she had brought something positive into their lives. After Thomas left, Grace continued her search with renewed determination. The envelope had to be somewhere. It was the missing piece of this puzzle, the key to understanding why Mrs. Miller was so obsessed with driving her away from the Evans family. The next morning, while organizing her things, Grace finally found the envelope. It was inside a book she rarely opened, tucked away at the bottom of a box of personal items. The envelope, yellowed with time, was still sealed, confirming she had never opened it. With trembling hands, she held it, trying to decide what to do. Should she open it to see what it contained? Or hand it directly to Thomas, respecting Beatrice's original intention? The decision was made for her when Thomas knocked on her bedroom door. He entered, looking tired as if he hadn't slept well. I found it, Grace said simply, holding out the envelope to him. Thomas took it cautiously, as if it were something fragile and precious. You didn't open it? No, it was never addressed to me. He examined the envelope, recognizing his wife's handwriting on the name written by hand. After a moment of hesitation, he opened it carefully. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. The first, a handwritten letter. The second, what appeared to be a medical exam. Thomas read the letter in silence, his expression changing as he absorbed the content. What does it say? Grace asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Thomas looked up, stunned. It's a DNA test. DNA? For what? For whom? He corrected, his voice faint. For Emily. The world seemed to stop for Grace. What? Beatrice did a DNA test comparing your blood with hers. You are sisters. The revelation hit Grace like a bolt of lightning. Sisters? She and Beatrice? How is that possible? It can't be, she murmured, stunned. My mother died when I was 5. My father raised me alone. According to this letter, your father is not your biological father. Beatrice found out by chance, while doing tests for a possible bone marrow transplant. The hospital identified an almost perfect match with an employee, you. She investigated and found out that you shared the same father, Richard Miller. Beatrice's father? Grace could barely process the information. That doesn't make sense. I didn't even know the Millers before I met Beatrice at the hospital. The letter says that Richard had a brief affair with your mother before marrying Beatrice's mother. He never knew you existed. Beatrice only found out after she started investigating the genetic compatibility. Grace sank onto the bed, trying to absorb the bombshell revelation. This explained Mrs. Miller's obsessive interest, her desperation to keep her away from the family. It wasn't just jealousy or protecting her daughter's memory. It was fear that the truth about her late husband's infidelity would come to light. "That's why Beatrice started talking to me at the hospital," Grace murmured, pieces of the puzzle falling into place in her mind. "That's why she showed me pictures of you, told me stories. She knew we were sisters. She wanted to get close to you, but she didn't know how to reveal the truth," Thomas confirmed, rereading the letter. "When she realized her condition was worsening, she decided to leave me this letter, so that I could tell you and Matthew that you are family." "Family," Grace repeated, the word sounding strange on her lips. "I have a family." "That's why you look so much like her," Thomas said, observing her with new eyes. "It's not just a casual resemblance. You share the same DNA." Emily chose that moment to wake up, her cry alerting Grace. She picked her up, looking at her daughter with a new perspective. "Does this mean that Emily and Matthew are cousins?" Thomas completed. "And Mrs. Miller is her grandmother, whether she likes it or not." The irony of the situation did not escape either of them. The woman who had tried so hard to push Grace away was, in fact, Emily's grandmother. The family Grace had so longed for was there all along, united by blood ties no one had suspected. "What do we do now?" she asked uncertainly. Thomas folded the letter carefully, putting it back in the envelope along with the test result. "First, we need to process this. It's a huge revelation for all of us. Does Mrs. Miller know that I'm Richard's daughter?" "I don't know. The letter doesn't mention if Beatrice told her. But given her behavior, she knows," Grace concluded. "Or at least she suspects. That's why she's so desperate to get me out of here. She doesn't want the truth about her husband to come out. It makes sense. Vera always idealized Richard as the perfect husband. The idea that he had an affair, that he had a child out of wedlock. It would destroy the image she built of him." Grace gently rocked Emily, trying to calm her. "And now? Are you going to tell her we know?" Thomas thought for a moment. "Not yet. We need to decide how to handle this first. It's a delicate situation for everyone. And what about Matthew? He has the right to know that Emily is his cousin, that I'm his mother's sister. Yes, but we need to choose the right moment, the right words. He's too young to understand all the implications." Grace nodded in agreement. "And what about us, Thomas? What does this mean for whatever is happening between us?" The question hung in the air, laden with meaning. Thomas looked at her for a long time before answering. "I don't know yet. I need to process all of this. The revelation that you knew Beatrice was already difficult. Finding out you're her sister is—" He didn't complete the sentence, but he didn't need to. "I understand," Grace said, trying to hide her disappointment. "It's a lot to take in at once. But I know one thing for sure," Thomas continued, approaching her. "You and Emily are family. Not just temporary employees, not just friends, family. And that changes everything." Before they could continue the conversation, they heard the doorbell ring insistently. Moments later, Mrs. Miller's voice echoed down the hall, calling for Thomas. The two exchanged apprehensive glances. The moment of truth had arrived sooner than they expected. With Emily in her arms, Grace followed Thomas to the living room, where Mrs. Miller awaited them with a stormy expression. "Ah, good. You're both here," she said, her tone falsely cordial. "I have an important matter to discuss with you." In her hands she held what looked like a folder full of documents. The look she gave Grace was a mixture of anger, fear, and something more complex, a reluctant recognition. "I've discovered some interesting things about our housekeeper," Mrs. Miller continued, the sarcasm evident in the last word. "Things I'm sure Thomas will want to know before deciding if she remains in this house." Grace and Thomas exchanged a quick look. He nodded discreetly as if to say, "Leave it to me." "Actually, Vera," Thomas began calmly, "I believe I already know what you're going to say." And yes, Grace stays. "She and Emily are part of this family now, whether you like it or not." Mrs. Miller's expression went from confidence to confusion, and then to shock as she understood the meaning of his words. "You know, that she's—" her voice failed her. "Beatrice's sister? Yes, we know. Beatrice left a letter explaining everything along with the DNA test." Mrs. Miller turned pale, leaning on the sofa for support. "Impossible. Beatrice would never do that. She already did, Vera. She wanted Grace to know the truth, to be part of Matthew's life. She's his aunt, after all." "Lies." Mrs. Miller exclaimed, regaining some of her combativeness. "This woman made all this up to get close to you, to take my daughter's place." "The DNA test doesn't lie, Vera," Thomas replied firmly. "And now everything makes sense. The physical resemblance, Matthew's immediate connection to her. It's not a coincidence." Mrs. Miller turned to Grace, her eyes blazing with fury. "You planned this from the beginning. You found out who she was. You came to this house on purpose." "It wasn't like that," Grace defended herself. "I didn't know I was Beatrice's sister until today. She's the one who found out through the transplant compatibility tests." "Lies! Richard never—" "He wouldn't have—" Mrs. Miller seemed to struggle with the reality that was unfolding. "Richard had an affair with my mother before he married you," Grace said softly. "He never knew about me. No one knew until Beatrice found out by chance." The words seemed to hit Mrs. Miller like physical blows. She staggered, sitting down heavily on the sofa. Her entire combative posture crumbled, replaced by an expression of defeat. "All these years," she murmured, more to herself than to the others. "All these years believing we were the perfect family." Grace approached hesitantly, still holding Emily. "Mrs. Miller, I know this is hard to accept, but we are family. Emily is your granddaughter just as much as Matthew is." The mention of the baby made Mrs. Miller look up, observing her as if seeing her for the first time. Emily, oblivious to the unfolding drama, smiled at the older woman, reaching out a tiny hand in her direction. Something in the baby's innocent gesture seemed to touch Mrs. Miller. A single tear ran down her aged face, and for a brief moment, the mask of bitterness fell, revealing only a woman who had lost too much. Her husband, her daughter, and now the illusions she had nurtured for decades. "She has his eyes," she said at last, her voice almost a whisper. "The same eyes as Richard." It was the first concession, small but significant, a reluctant acknowledgement of a truth she could no longer deny. And perhaps the first step toward an understanding that none of them had imagined possible until then. At that moment, with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows of the Evans mansion, 4 lives marked by loss, secrecy, and pain began to glimpse the possibility of a new beginning, not as strangers united by chance, but as a family united by blood and perhaps, eventually by love. The days following the revelation were filled with delicate adjustments and difficult conversations at the Evans mansion. Mrs. Miller, after the initial shock, retreated to her home, claiming she needed time to process everything. Thomas respected her space, knowing his mother-in-law needed to reconcile the idealized image of her late husband with the reality she had just discovered. Matthew seemed satisfied with the answer, returning to his drawing with renewed enthusiasm. Mrs. Miller looked at him for a long moment before turning to Grace. "Can we talk?" "Alone?" Grace nodded, handing Emily to Thomas. The 2 women went out into the garden, sitting on a bench under the shade of a crabapple tree. For a few moments neither of them spoke, the silence heavy between them. "I didn't come here to apologize," Mrs. Miller finally began. "What I did believing I was protecting my family." "I understand," Grace replied, keeping her voice neutral. "But," the older woman continued, choosing her words carefully, "I recognize that I may have been mistaken in my methods, and in my judgment of you." Coming from Mrs. Miller, that was the closest to an apology Grace could expect. "What Richard did," Mrs. Miller's voice faltered slightly, "it wasn't fair to your mother or to me, but most of all it wasn't fair to you. Growing up without knowing who you really were. The man who raised me will always be my father," Grace replied firmly. "But now I understand why I always felt like a piece of my life's puzzle was missing." Mrs. Miller observed her with new eyes, noticing for the first time not only the resemblances to Beatrice, but also the undeniable traits of Richard, the shape of her chin, the way she tilted her head when thoughtful. "Emily looks like Beatrice as a baby," she commented almost involuntarily. "The same curious eyes, the same smile." "I wish they could have known each other," Grace said, sadness evident in her voice. "They did, in a way. Beatrice knew about you, watched you from a distance before gathering the courage to approach you at the hospital." Mrs. Miller rummaged in her purse, pulling out a small blue leather-bound diary. "I found this among her things that I kept. It's the diary she kept during her stay. There are several mentions of you." Grace took the diary with trembling hands, feeling the emotional weight of the object. Are you sure you want to give me this? I'm not giving it. I'm lending it. She was my daughter, and this is part of her. But you have the right to know her too through her own words. It was a significant concession, a small step toward a possible understanding between the two women. Thank you, Grace said sincerely. I promise to return it as soon as I've read it. There's no hurry. Mrs. Miller hesitated before continuing. I've been thinking, if you really are Richard's daughter, then Emily is my granddaughter. And she seemed to struggle with the words. I would like to get to know her better if you'll allow it. The offer surprised Grace. Of course, Emily deserves to have a grandmother in her life. A tacit agreement was established between them. Not friendship, not yet, but a ceasefire. A mutual recognition that the children's well-being came above any personal resentment. When they returned to the house, they found Thomas and Matthew building a makeshift fort in the living room with sheets and cushions. Emily watched, fascinated from the rug, trying to reach the colorful fabrics. What are you doing? Grace asked, smiling at the scene. Building our family fortress, Matthew explained, excited. To protect all of us from the storms, just like when you and Emily arrived here. The simplicity of the childish explanation moved everyone. In different ways, each of them had sought shelter from life's storms in that house, in that unlikely family. Can Grandma help too? Matthew asked, looking hopefully at Mrs. Miller. For a moment, Grace feared the older woman would refuse, that pride would speak louder. But to her surprise, Mrs. Miller smiled, a genuine smile that softened the lines of her aged face. Of course I can, she replied, putting her purse aside and bending down with some difficulty to help her grandson. But we need to make a special space for Emily too. The rest of the afternoon passed in an unexpected truce. It wasn't perfect, not without moments of discomfort, but it was a start. That night, after everyone had left, Mrs. Miller to her house, promising to return on Sunday for lunch, Matthew to bed after 3 stories and countless goodnight kisses, Emily to her crib after the last feeding. Grace and Thomas met again on the balcony, the place that had become their private refuge for heartfelt conversations. I don't think he's confused, Thomas replied thoughtfully. For him, Mom is whoever takes care of him, whoever loves him, whoever is present. Beatrice will always be his biological mother, but you— He looked at her intently. You are becoming his mother of the heart. The idea warmed Grace from the inside. To be Matthew's mother of the heart, while honoring Beatrice's memory, not as a substitute, but as a continuation of the love he deserved to receive. I think I can live with that, she said softly. Thomas smiled, taking her hand in his. And what about us? Do you think we could— Before he could complete the question, Emily, who had recently started crawling, escaped Mrs. Miller's and Matthew's watch, heading determinedly toward where they were. It was her first truly independent journey, and her little face shone with pride at her accomplishment. Look at you, Grace exclaimed, opening her arms to receive her. My little adventurer. Thomas joined the celebration, applauding the baby's achievement. This calls for a celebration. What do you think of a picnic in the park tomorrow? All of us together. Picnic, picnic! Matthew, who had run after Emily, jumped excitedly at the idea. If the weather permits, why not? Grace agreed, lifting Emily into her arms. I can bring my orange cake, Mrs. Miller offered, approaching. The one Matthew loves. And the one Emily hasn't tried yet, Thomas added. It's decided then. Tomorrow, a Vasconcelos Turner family picnic. The compound name came out naturally without premeditation, but its meaning did not go unnoticed by any of the adults. It was a declaration, a recognition that what they were building went beyond the traditional conventions of family. The next morning, Central Park witnessed the unusual gathering of a family that defied definitions. Matthew ran between the trees, chasing soap bubbles that Thomas blew. Emily, sitting on a checkered blanket, tried to reach the sunbeams filtering through the leaves. Mrs. Miller, surprisingly relaxed, served slices of her cake while talking to Grace about family recipes she wanted to teach her. Beatrice never had patience for the kitchen, the older woman commented with a touch of nostalgia. She always said she had more important things to do. And she did, Grace replied gently. She was brilliant at what she did. Yes, she was. Mrs. Miller looked at Grace with curiosity. You're different from her in that way. More practical, more down-to-earth. We grew up in very different realities. And yet there's something in you that reminds me so much of her. Not just physically. It's something more, an essence. The Miller DNA, perhaps? Grace joked lightly. To her surprise, Mrs. Miller laughed, a rare and precious sound. Perhaps. Richard used to say that all Millers were born with a particular stubbornness. So that's where it comes from. Grace smiled. I always wondered why I was so obstinate. It's a useful trait if well directed. Mrs. Miller watched Emily, who was now trying to crawl toward a butterfly. She has it too. Look how determined she is, just like Matthew, Grace commented, watching the boy who, even after several failed attempts, continued trying to catch the bubbles before they burst. Yes, just like him. Mrs. Miller paused significantly. You know, Grace, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you came into their lives. Into our lives. The confession caught Grace by surprise. Really? Really? Thomas and Matthew were existing, not living, after Beatrice passed. You brought life back into that house. And as much as it was hard to admit at first, that's something I'll be forever grateful for. The sincere words deeply touched Grace. It wasn't a formal apology for everything that had happened, but it was something perhaps more valuable. A genuine recognition of her worth, of her contribution to the family. Thank you. For Mrs. Miller, that means a lot to hear. Vera, the older woman corrected gently, just Vera. I think we're past the formalities, don't you? After all, we're family now. Family, Grace repeated, savoring the word. Yes, we are. At that moment, Thomas approached, carrying an exhausted and laughing Matthew in his arms. Someone here needs a snack to refuel. Grandma's cake, the boy exclaimed, reaching out his hands. The rest of the afternoon passed in a harmony that just months before, none of them would have believed possible. Conversations flowed naturally. Laughter was shared. Memories were created, not to replace the old ones, but to complement them, to build a new family narrative. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange, the small family gathered their belongings and started the journey back home. Matthew, exhausted, fell asleep in the back seat of the car next to Emily, who soon followed him into sleep. It was a perfect day, Thomas commented, looking in the rearview mirror at the sleeping children. It really was, Grace agreed, watching the urban landscape pass by the window. It's strange to think how it all started. A stormy night, a door that opened. Fate has a peculiar sense of humor, he reflected. Or maybe it's just life, finding a way even in the most unlikely circumstances. When they arrived at the mansion, each carried a sleeping child. Vera, who had come in her own car, helped organize the picnic leftovers before saying goodbye. I'll be here for lunch on Sunday, she reminded them, and I'll bring that photo album I mentioned. There are some pictures of Richard when he was young that you'll like to see. Grace, I can't wait, she replied sincerely. After Vera left, and the children were put in their respective beds, Grace and Thomas found themselves in the hallway between the rooms. We still haven't finished our conversation from yesterday, he commented with a suggestive smile. We haven't? I was about to ask something important when we were interrupted by a certain little crawling girl. Oh yes, Grace smiled, remembering. And what was it again? Thomas approached, taking her hands in his. I was about to ask if you believe that we, you and I, could have a future together. Not just as co-parents to these wonderful children, but as a couple. Grace's heart raced. Despite all the signs, all the moments shared in recent weeks, hearing the question phrased so directly still made her feel vulnerable. Wouldn't it be complicated? Because of everything that happened, because of who I am. Life is complicated, Grace. Relationships are complicated. But the real question is it worth trying despite the complications? She looked at him, seeing in his eyes not just desire or attraction, but something deeper, respect, admiration, an affection that had grown slowly, based on real shared experiences. It is, she finally replied with conviction. It's very much worth it. His smile lit up his face in a way Grace had rarely seen. Thomas leaned in slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull back if she wanted. But Grace didn't pull back. Instead, she met him halfway, sealing the moment with a kiss, soft, full of promise and possibilities. When they separated, they remained close, foreheads touching, as if no one wanted to break the spell of the moment. One day at a time, she murmured, remembering the promise they had made. One day at a time, Thomas agreed, but together. 6 months later. The garden of the Evans mansion was decorated with simple elegance for a small celebration. Colorful lanterns hung from the tree branches, creating a cozy atmosphere as the sun began to set. Round tables arranged on the lawn accommodated about 30 guests, close friends, work colleagues, some family members. At the center of it all, a larger table brought together the host family. Matthew, now 5 years old, wore a blue dress shirt that matched his father's. Emily, about to turn 1, wore a white dress with floral details, her dark curls held back with a delicate ribbon. Mrs. Miller, elegant in an emerald green suit, chatted animatedly with Grace's father, a grey-haired gentleman who had made the long trip from upstate to be present for the occasion. After the revelation about her origins, Grace had decided to tell the truth to the man who had raised her. To her surprise, he wasn't shocked. "I always knew there was a possibility," he confessed. "Your mother was honest with me before we got married. But you were my daughter from the moment I first held you in my arms, and nothing could change that." The unconditional acceptance from her adoptive father gave Grace the peace she needed to truly embrace her new beginning. And now he was there meeting his new family, sharing stories of her childhood, creating connections that had once seemed impossible. At the center of the table, Grace and Thomas watched the scene with full hearts. It wasn't a wedding. It was still too early for that. They both agreed, but rather a celebration of family, a formal recognition of what they had been building together over the past few months. "Your attention, please," Thomas called, standing up with a glass in his hand. The buzz of conversations gradually subsided. "I'd like to thank you all for being here today, sharing this moment with us." He looked at Grace with affection, extending his hand to her, and she stood up to join him. "Life doesn't always follow the paths we plan," he continued. "Sometimes it takes us on unexpected detours, introduces us to people who completely transform our journey." Grace squeezed his hand lightly, encouraging him to continue. "A year ago, this family was fragmented, incomplete. Today we are here, celebrating not only newly discovered blood ties, but especially the bonds of love we have chosen to form. Because family, in the end, is just that. People who choose to be together, supporting each other, regardless of the circumstances." Matthew, sensing the importance of the moment, also stood up, positioning himself between the two adults. Emily, not wanting to be left out, reached her arms out to Grace, who picked her up. "Today we make official what we already knew in our hearts," Thomas continued, his voice filled with emotion. "That we are a family. Not conventional, not traditional, but genuine in every shared feeling." Mrs. Miller was the first to stand, raising her glass in a silent toast. The other guests followed her example. There were no elaborate speeches, no formal rituals, just the sincere recognition that sometimes the most beautiful families emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. Later, when most of the guests had left and the children were sleeping soundly, Grace and Thomas danced slowly under the colorful lanterns in the garden. There was no music other than the gentle rustling of the leaves and the occasional call of nocturnal birds, but it was enough to guide their synchronized steps. "Happy?" he asked, lightly stroking her back. "More than I ever thought possible," Grace replied, resting her head on his shoulder. For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. It was just the two of them, dancing under the starry New York sky, celebrating not only the love growing between them, but also the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. "You know what I think sometimes?" Thomas murmured against her hair. "What?" "That maybe Beatrice orchestrated all of this somehow. That from wherever she is, she found a way to make sure none of us would be alone." Grace smiled at the idea. "I like to think so. That she's looking out for us, approving of what we've built. I'm sure she is." He pulled back slightly to look her in the eyes. "And what we've built is something truly special. Grace, something I want to preserve and cultivate for the rest of my life." The words weren't a formal proposal, but they carried the weight of a promise, of commitment, of intention, of a shared future. "Me too," she replied simply, sealing the moment with a kiss. Above them, a particularly bright star twinkled in the night sky, as if in approval. And in their rooms, Matthew and Emily slept peacefully, protected by the love of a family that had found its way through the storm to the serenity of a new dawn. That night, in the Evans mansion, there were no more secrets to be revealed, no more barriers to overcome. There was only peace, acceptance, and the promise of many happy days ahead. A family united not just by blood, but primarily by the conscious choice to love and care for one another, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. And in the end, wasn't that what truly mattered? Not the origins, not the winding paths, but the shared destiny, built day by day, moment by moment, with love, respect, and the courage to believe that, even in the most unlikely situations, the heart finds its true home. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Grace and Thomas has touched your hearts. For those of you who have followed this emotional journey with us, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about unconventional families and new beginnings. Find it by clicking the link on the left. If this narrative moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. What city are you watching from? Tell us which moment in the story touched your heart the most. Every day we bring new stories that explore the complexity of human relationships, second chances, and the encounters that transform lives. Until our next meeting, remember, sometimes life's storms don't come to knock us down, but to guide us to the place where we truly belong.